fire did not just consume parchment. It devoured 3 years of Alara's soul. She knelt on the freezing stone floor of the high court, watching her masterwork, the only map capable of saving their dying kingdom, turn to ash. Above her stood King Kalen, his massive alpha frame radiating absolute contempt. To him, she was just an unpresented Omega, a useless girl playing with pencils while their borders bled. Kalen growled that she was nothing, and threw the last piece of vellum into the flames, declaring that her father had died a madman and he would not waste his warriors on her fairy tales. He ordered her back to the kitchens or to leave entirely. The counselors laughed as the public rejection snapped their faint bond, freezing her wounded soul. Shifting her spine into solid iron, she stood up, pulled her shawl tight, and walked out into the lethal screaming blizzard of the northern expanse. She would rather face the deadly ice as a free soul than stay with a king who burned her heart. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below because I would love to know how far this story reaches. The subterranean depths of the citadel were a stark contrast to the grand roaring halls above. Down here the air was heavy with the scent of ancient dust, decaying paper, and the cold moisture that seeped continuously through the stones of the mountain. Alara had spent most of her 20 years in this silent vault, buried beneath the weight of a society that measured a person's worth solely by the strength of their jaw and the sharpness of their claws. To the proud warriors of the Silver Peak Pack, the archives were nothing more than a graveyard for useless memories, a dusty storage room for treaties that had long been broken. For Alara, however, it was both her sanctuary and her prison. She was an unpresented Omega, a designation that marked her as the lowest tier of the pack hierarchy, a creature born to serve without question, to clean without complaint, and to remain entirely invisible. Her daily life was a synchronized rhythm of isolation and quiet degradation, defined by the flickering glow of cheap tallow candles and the perpetual chill that lived deep within her bones. Every morning began before the first light of dawn broke over the jagged peaks of the northern mountains. While the rest of the fortress slept, Alara would rise from her small straw pallet in the corner of the map room, her muscles aching from the cold that never truly left the stone floors. She would pull on her faded gray tunic, its wool worn thin by years of repeated washing, and begin her endless rounds of chores. She carried heavy wooden buckets of freezing water down the winding spiral staircases to scrub the grime from the long library tables. She meticulously dusted the thousands of leather-bound volumes, careful not to tear the fragile pages that held the forgotten history of her ancestors. Above her head, she could always hear the distant rhythmic thumping of the warrior training grounds. The heavy footsteps of the alpha soldiers and the metallic ringing of steel blades striking shields would vibrate through the ceiling, a constant reminder of the brutal world she was excluded from. They were the protectors celebrated by the pack, while she was merely the girl who wiped away their dust. Whenever a low-ranking warrior or a messenger did happen to venture down into the dim light of the archives, they treated Alara with less regard than the furniture. They would throw their muddy boots onto the clean tables, bark orders for specific historical logs without looking her in the eye, and leave a trail of filth behind them for her to clean up. They never spoke her name, calling her only maid or Omega with a tone of casual dismissiveness that stung worse than a physical blow. She remembered a specific afternoon when a high-ranking general had come searching for an old border treaty. He had accidentally knocked over her small inkpot, ruining a delicate sketch she had spent hours working on. Instead of apologizing, he had simply sneered at her, telling her that an Omega had no business playing with the tools of scholars and that she should stick to sweeping the floors. Alara had swallowed her pride, lowering her head in the required gesture of submission. But inside her chest, a silent fire had begun to burn. She was not useless, and she knew that the blood of true creators ran through her veins even if no one else could see it. This resilience was the only inheritance left to her by her father, the pack's former chief cartographer. He had been a visionary man who believed that the mountains held secrets far greater than any military defense line, but his obsession had eventually alienated him from the High Council. After he went missing in a savage winter storm, the pack had quickly stripped his family of any remaining status, leaving Alara to inherit his debts and his neglected position. The other wolves viewed his death as proof of his madness, a cautionary tale about what happened when an individual forgot their place in the rigid order of the pack. But Alara knew her father was not mad. She remembered the warmth of his large hands guiding her small fingers across the parchment, teaching her to look beyond the surface of the ink and to listen to the silent language of the world. He had taught her that invisibility could be a shield, a quiet space where a person could observe the truths that the arrogant and the loud completely missed. In her loneliness, she embraced that shield, using the long hours of isolation to study the ancient texts and hone a craft that the warriors considered a worthless hobby. As the years passed, her isolation deepened, and the archive became a cocoon where her thoughts grew complex and her observations sharp. She watched from the shadows as the kingdom grew increasingly blind to its own vulnerabilities, her internal ledger tracking the slow decay of the pack's traditional defenses. She knew every crack in the lower foundations, every vulnerable pass that the scouts overlooked out of sheer laziness, and every sign of tension in the surrounding valleys. She tried to tell herself that it did not matter, that the survival of the Silver Peak pack was not her responsibility, but she could not ignore the impending storm. The air in the deep vaults was changing, growing heavier, with an unnatural static electricity that made her hairs stand on end. She could feel a strange tension building within the very stones of the citadel, a silent warning that the peaceful isolation she had endured for so long was about to be violently shattered by a threat that the arrogant alphas above were entirely unprepared to face. She stared at the dark winding stairs leading up to the grand halls, unaware that the very people who despised her existence would soon be forced to seek the secrets hidden within her lonely sanctuary. The true magic of the Silver Peak pack did not reside in the sharp steel of their broadswords, or the deafening roars of their alpha warriors echoing across the training yards. It lived deep within the silent marrow of the mountain, waiting for someone who possessed the humility to listen. Alara was one of the very few who still remembered how to hear the earth speak. Long after the heavy footsteps of the soldiers had faded into the upper levels of the citadel, and the midnight bells had chimed their solemn notes, she would retreat into the deepest forgotten cavern of the archives. This was her true sanctuary, a hidden natural grotto located directly beneath the oldest foundations of the fortress, where the refined stone of the castle gave way to the raw, jagged rock of the mountain core. Here there were no tapestries or banners celebrating bloody conquests, just the profound echoing silence of the ancient world. Alara slipped off her worn leather shoes and stepped barefoot onto the freezing stone. The initial shock of the cold sent a sharp ache up her legs, but she did not flinch. She closed her eyes and took a long, steady breath, letting the frantic, anxious energy of her daily life as a subjugated omega drain away into the floor. Slowly, she knelt and pressed both of her bare palms flat against the rough, unyielding surface of the cavern floor. For a long moment, there was nothing but the dark and the cold. Then a faint vibration began to build deep within the rock, a slow, rhythmic thrumming that matched the beating of her own heart. The Weaver's sight, a rare and sacred gift passed down through her bloodline, was waking up. To the rest of the pack, a mountain was just a static obstacle of granite and ice to be conquered or defended. But to Alara, it was a massive, living, breathing organism, crisscrossed with a brilliant subterranean nervous system. As she pushed her consciousness deeper into the stone, the darkness behind her closed eyelids began to bloom with light. She saw the ley lines. They appeared in her mind as glowing threads of liquid gold, pulsing and shifting like deep underground rivers of starlight. She could feel the distinct personality of the mountain, the stubborn resistance of the granite ridges, the slow grinding agony of the ancient glaciers, and the hidden comforting warmth of deep geothermal pockets that the military scouts above knew absolutely nothing about. The earth whispered to her in a language of pressure and temperature, revealing secrets that no traditional map could ever capture. She felt the exact depth of hidden ravines, the structural integrity of every natural bridge, and the shifting fault lines that could swallow an army if they stepped incorrectly. She was not just observing the land, she was physically connecting with it, her spirit expanding until she felt as massive and eternal as the peaks themselves. Opening her eyes, she quickly moved to a large wooden drafting table she had dragged into the grotto years ago. The table was covered in fresh, unmarked vellum and an array of charcoal sticks. Her hands were still trembling with the residual energy of the mountain as she picked up a piece of dark charcoal and began to draw. She did not use measuring tools or standard grid lines. Her movements were fluid and trance-like, guided purely by the lingering golden vision burned into her mind. The map that emerged was a masterpiece of organic geometry, a swirling, intricate web of pathways that detailed the exact flow of the ley lines through the treacherous northern expanse. She drew the safe passages where the ice was thick enough to support a marching battalion and marked the deadly, invisible hollows where the snow hid bottomless chasms. This was the true architecture of their world, an impossible landscape of hidden grace that the warlords of the High Council had chosen to ignore. As she worked, she could not help but reflect on the bitter irony of her existence. The Alpha King demanded absolute strength to protect his borders, but he was entirely blind to the invisible shield that lay directly beneath his boots. He relied on heavy armor and brute force while she held the actual key to navigating the lethal frozen wastes that surrounded their home. Her heart ached with a complex mixture of resentment and profound sadness. She did not draw these maps for glory or recognition, because she knew her society would never accept wisdom from a lowly omega. She drew them because the earth demanded to be understood, and because in the quiet solitude of her work, she felt a profound sense of purpose that no king could ever burn away. Her soul was woven into the very fabric of the valleys and ridges she sketched, making her a silent sovereign of the shadows. But tonight, the song of the mountain was entirely different. As she pressed her charcoal hard against the parchment detailing the outermost borders of the frost peaks, the golden light in her mind suddenly flickered and turned a sickly bruised purple. Alara gasped, dropping the charcoal as a wave of cold, nauseating dread washed over her. The ley lines were screaming. She placed her hands back on the bare stone, pushing her awareness as far north as she possibly could. The rhythmic pulse of the earth was being violently disrupted by a massive heavy stomping that felt like a localized earthquake. It was not a natural occurrence. It was the marching rhythm of the Iron Legion. The enemy was not merely gathering at the borders as the king believed. They had already bypassed the outer defensive perimeter using a dark magic that was actively corrupting the natural energy of the land. Ilara pulled her hands back, her breath catching in her throat as the terrifying realization set in. The invasion was already here, and the mighty citadel was entirely blind to the fact that their walls were about to fall. The heavy realization of the invasion forced Ilara to move with a frantic energy. She ran back up the winding stone stairs to her sleeping alcove, knowing she could not stay in a fortress about to become a frozen tomb. As she hurriedly stuffed her few remaining possessions into a worn leather satchel, her trembling fingers brushed against a carved wooden compass. It was completely broken, the iron needle stuck, pointing not toward true north but toward the deep heart of the mountain. The rough texture of the wood instantly pulled her mind backward, plunging her into an agonizing memory she had tried to bury. It was the memory of the night the pack had stripped her of her family and taught her the terrifying cost of possessing the Weaver sight. She had been only 10 years old, shivering in the grand hall as the winter wind howled violently against the stained glass windows. Her father Elias stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the imposing figures of the Alpha Council. He was a slender man with kind, tired eyes and a brilliant mind that saw the world in glowing golden threads. He had just presented them with a detailed map warning of a structural weakness in the eastern ridges, predicting a devastating avalanche if they continued to march their heavy battalions through the unstable pass. But the counselors, led by Kaelin's ruthless predecessor, did not see a brilliant scholar trying to save their lives. They saw a weak, delusional Omega who dared to tell Alphas how to run their endless war. They mocked him, relentlessly calling his visions the frantic hallucinations of a diseased mind. When her father refused to yield, begging them to listen to the song of the earth, the king had struck him down with the back of his hand. The sickening sound of his body hitting the stone floor still echoed in Alara's nightmares. They branded him a traitor to the pack's strength and sentenced him to immediate exile. To be cast out into the northern expanse without supplies during the dead of winter was a death sentence. Before the guards dragged him away into the howling white abyss, her father had managed to break free for just a single desperate moment. He rushed to Alara, dropping to his knees and pressing his warm, calloused hands against her tear-streaked cheeks. He did not cry. Instead, his eyes flared with a brilliant, blinding gold that mirrored the hidden ley lines of the world. He pressed his forehead directly against hers, and she felt a sudden, agonizing surge of ancient magic pour into her fragile mind. The Weaver's sight had been fully transferred, anchoring the heavy responsibility of the earth to her young soul. "Hide it, Alara," he had whispered, his voice breaking with profound sorrow and unconditional love. "They are blind, and they will destroy what they cannot understand. Keep the map in your heart until the day the mountain truly needs you." Then they tore him away, and the massive iron doors of the citadel slammed shut, sealing his fate in the frozen wasteland. That traumatic night had forged the iron cage of her absolute silence. Alara had spent the next 10 long years terrified of her own mind, suppressing the golden visions, and playing the role of the useless, obedient maid perfectly. She knew that if the dominant council ever discovered she possessed the exact same sight as her father, they would not hesitate to throw her into the exact same blizzard. The deep trauma of watching him march to his brutal death had paralyzed her voice, convincing her that survival meant complete and utter invisibility. But as she stood in her dark subterranean room holding his broken wooden compass, the paralyzing ice of that old fear finally began to melt into a quiet, burning rage. The current king had already burned her map and rejected her truth, just as his predecessor had done to her father. There was nothing left for her to protect in this grand fortress of arrogant blind men. Her father had died because he tried to save people who loved their aggressive pride more than their own lives. She would not make the same fatal mistake. Alara securely fastened the heavy satchel across her chest and pulled her thick woolen cloak tightly around her narrow shoulders. She slipped out of the archives, avoiding the main heavily guarded corridors and navigating the secret dusty servant passages that only she knew. The citadel was in complete chaos above her, preparing their weapons for an enemy they foolishly believed was still weeks away. She reached a small, forgotten service door at the very base of the northern wall. The iron latch was frozen solid, but she pressed her bare palm against the freezing stone, summoning a tiny localized surge of geothermal heat from the ley line below to melt the thick ice. The heavy wood groaned open, revealing the terrifying chaotic fury of the northern expanse. The wind screamed like a wounded animal, blasting her pale face with sharp shards of ice that felt like broken glass.
Stepping over the stone threshold was the hardest thing she had ever done. It meant leaving the only miserable shelter she had ever known and walking into the very storm that had mercilessly swallowed her father.
But as her leather boots crunched into the deep, untouched snow, a strange, profound sense of empowerment washed over her. She was no longer a helpless victim of the citadel. She was a true daughter of the mountain, reclaiming her ancestral birthright in the shadows. She pushed the heavy door closed behind her, listening to the finality of the iron latch clicking solidly into place. She was completely alone in the deadly whiteout. But just as she took her first confident step toward the distant hidden ridges, a massive, unnatural shadow shifted in the swirling snow directly ahead of her. A low guttural growl vibrated through the frozen ground beneath her feet, a terrifying sound that did not belong to any wolf of the Silver Peak. The enemy had already breached the outer perimeter, and she had just walked directly into their hunting grounds. The colossal iron-bound gates of the southern outpost shattered inward with a sound like a dying god's scream. Black powder, dark sorcery, and the synchronized, crushing momentum of 50,000 armored foot soldiers tore through the valley, reducing the Silver Peak's proud outer ring of defenses to smoking, crimson rubble in less than an hour. Inside the Citadel's war room, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating stench of cold sweat, spilled ink, and sheer unadulterated panic. King Kalen stood at the head of the heavy tactical table, his massive fists pressed so hard against the map-strewn oak that the wood groaned under his immense weight. Around him, high-ranking alpha generals and aging counselors were shouting over one another, their voices cracking with desperation they had never known in their long lives. The traditional military charts laid out before them, the ones they had relied on for centuries, the ones they had used to proudly mock the visionaries, were entirely useless now. The Iron Legion wasn't advancing along the predictable trade roads. They were moving like a toxic plague, completely anticipating every single ambush point and exploiting defensive blind spots with terrifying mathematical precision. Kalen felt a dark, cold void opening in the center of his chest as report after report of bloody, catastrophic failure flooded the chamber. "Your Majesty, the western flank has completely collapsed." A breathless, bleeding scout gasped, collapsing onto his knees near the doorway. The enemy? They knew about the hidden trench. They bypassed it entirely and slaughtered the vanguard from behind. Kalen did not roar in fury as he usually did. His sharp, icy blue eyes were fixed on the charred remains of the great hearth across the room. Just a short time ago, in that exact spot, he had grabbed a delicate charcoal-sketched parchment from the trembling hands of a quiet, unpresented Omega girl and thrown it into the roaring flames. He had called her useless. He had told her that her father was a madman and that her intricate drawings were nothing but kitchen fairy tales, but now, staring at the chaotic red markers on his official war maps, the terrifying truth hit him like a physical blow. The path she had tried to show him, the hidden trail through the treacherous frost peaks, was exactly where the enemy vanguard was currently setting up their primary siege engines. She had seen it. She had mapped the living pulse of the earth, and he, in his blind, arrogant pride as an alpha king, had burned their only salvation. The utter failure of his traditional scouts was a humiliating realization that stripped away his royal ego. Kalen slammed his fist onto the table, shattering a stone marker into thousands of tiny gray shards. Silence, his alpha voice thundered, vibrating through the thick stone walls until the shouting counselors instantly froze, their breath catching in their throats. "We are blind because we chose to be blind," Kalen growled, his deep voice carrying a raw, jagged edge of profound regret that shocked everyone in the room. He turned to the High Counselor Valerius, who stood off to the side with a pale, trembling face. "Bring me Alara," the king commanded, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure steel. "Bring her to me right now with every single map her father ever drew." Valerius swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he lowered his head. "Your Majesty, she is gone," the counselor whispered, his voice thin and hollow. "The archive maids report that her quarters were emptied right after the court assembly. She walked out into the northern blizzard hours ago. No one can survive out there in this whiteout. She is surely dead." The words struck Kalen's heart with the force of a localized earthquake. The faint, unrecognized bond that had always subtly pulled him toward the quiet archivist, the connection he had brutally suppressed and ignored for years out of sheer societal arrogance, woke up with a violent, agonizing twist. It didn't feel dead. It felt like a fraying rope snapping under extreme tension, leaving a bleeding wound in his spirit. He looked out the high stone windows at the howling, screaming white vortex of the northern expanse. The storm was a lethal monster, capable of freezing a grown warrior to death in minutes, let alone a fragile, unpresented girl clad in nothing but a thin woolen shawl. A wave of profound self-loathing washed over him, drowning out the ambient noise of the war room. He had driven her into that frozen hell. He had looked at the savior of his people and seen only a disposable piece of trash. Kalen didn't hesitate. He tore off his heavy ceremonial silver breastplate, letting the expensive metal clatter onto the floor as he grabbed his thickest winter fur cloak and strapped his heavy broadsword to his waist. "Your Majesty, what are you doing?" General Boris shouted, stepping forward to block his path. "The enemy is at our gates. You cannot leave the citadel now. You're our commander." Kalen looked at his oldest general with a gaze so fiercely determined that the older wolf immediately stepped back. "If I stay here, we all die within 3 days, Kalen stated, his voice dropping into a dangerous absolute calm. "I'm going into the wastes to find the woman I threw away. She is the only one who holds the true map of this mountain, and if I have to crawl on my knees through the ice to bring her back, I will." He did not wait for their approval. He turned and marched out of the war room, his heavy boots echoing like a drumbeat of doom down the corridor. As he reached the massive, frozen northern sally port, he pushed past the terrified guards and stepped directly into the blinding, screaming white void, his internal wolf howling in agony as the freezing wind immediately erased the citadel behind him, leaving him entirely alone in a merciless world of ice and regret. The howling fury of the northern blizzard was a physical wall of solid ice, but Kalen pushed through it with a desperate, animalistic ferocity. The wind screamed in his ears like 1,000 dying warriors, shredding the heavy layers of his fur cloak and plastering his face with sharp, blinding shards of frozen snow. His alpha tracking senses, usually flawless on any battlefield, were completely useless in this chaotic white void. The extreme cold froze the moisture in his nostrils, erasing all sense, while the shifting drifts of deep snow instantly obliterated any physical footprints she might have left behind. Yet he refused to stop, his heavy leather boots sinking waist deep into the treacherous drifts as he dragged his massive frame up the frozen slopes of the outer ridge. He was not tracking her by sight or smell. He was being pulled by the raw, bleeding fracture of their shattered bond, a faint spiritual thread that pulsed in his chest like a painful, dying heartbeat. Every step he took was an exercise in agonizing self-loathing. Images of the court assembly burned brightly in his mind, refusing to be washed away by the whiteout. He remembered the fragile, trembling way she had held out her master map, her charcoal-stained fingers shaking under the weight of his suffocating, arrogant aura. He remembered the cruel, dismissive words he had growled at her before throwing her 3 years of dedication into the roaring hearth fire. He had called her useless because she couldn't swing a sword, completely blind to the reality that her brilliant mind held the absolute key to their survival. The immense pride that had defined his entire reign felt like a heavy, suffocating chain around his neck. He had thought he was a strong king protecting his pack, but he was nothing more than a foolish, short-sighted tyrant who had driven his true savior into a frozen grave. Internal wolf howls of pure grief echoed in his mind, a raw demand to find the mate he had so brutally rejected. As he reached the high, windswept plateau known as the Whispering Ridge, the air pressure suddenly dropped with a terrifying finality. The storm grew even more violent, turning into a localized vortex that threatened to tear him off the cliffside and drop him into the bottomless chasm below. Kellen fell to his knees, his hands clawing at the frozen ice beneath him as his breath came in short, ragged gasps. The cold was finally starting to slow his rapid alpha circulation, a dull numbness spreading from his fingertips down into his very bones. For a single terrifying moment, despair threatened to swallow him whole. What if she was already gone? What if her fragile body had already succumbed to the lethal frost hours ago, buried forever beneath the beautiful, unyielding snow? The thought of her dying alone, believing she was completely worthless and hated by her pack, sent a surge of hot, desperate adrenaline through his veins, forcing him back onto his feet. Suddenly, the bleeding fracture in his chest flared with a strange electrical heat. It wasn't the warm, comforting hum of a completed mate bond, but a sharp, localized pull that dragged his gaze toward a massive dark silhouette shifting in the whiteout ahead. He forced his frozen limbs to move, staggering toward the shape until the solid outline of a natural granite overhang emerged from the swirling snow. It was a hidden cave entrance, entirely invisible from the lower valleys, its opening partially shielded by a thick wall of frozen briars. Kalen lunged forward, crashing through the brittle thorns and tumbling onto the hard, dry stone floor inside. The sudden absence of the screaming wind was deafening, replaced by the heavy, echoing sound of his own ragged breathing. He scrambled to his feet, his icy blue eyes straining against the deep pitch-black shadows of the cavern. "Alara," he croaked, His voice raw, hoarse, and completely broken, devoid of any royal authority. He took a single step into the darkness, his hands extended outward like a blind man searching for a lifeline. The air deep within the cave was surprisingly warm, thick, with the rich, grounded scent of damp earth, and the underlying static charge of pure, unrefined ley-line magic. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, he saw a faint, rhythmic golden light pulsing at the very back of the cavern. It wasn't a campfire. It was a living, breathing tapestry of light emanating directly from the stone walls, illuminating a small cloaked figure sitting cross-legged on the floor. Alara was alive. She didn't look up at his approach, her face pale but perfectly calm, as her small hands rested flat against a glowing golden vein running through the rock. She looked like a powerful ancient deity of the mountain, entirely removed from the fragile, invisible maid he had terrorized in the archives. Kalen sank to his knees a few feet away from her, the heavy weight of his broadsword clattering loudly against the cave floor. He wanted to reach out, to wrap his massive arms around her and pull her into his chest to shield her from the residual cold. But the absolute radiant power rolling off her small frame made him freeze. The utter transformation of her presence struck him with absolute awe. She was no longer a silent outcast craving validation. She was a sovereign entity in her own right, deeply connected to the very fabric of the world. The stark realization of his own complete unworthiness hit him like a physical blow, pinning him to the stone. He had come out into the storm to rescue a helpless girl, but as he stared into her glowing, golden eyes that finally turned to meet his, he realized with profound humility that he was the one who desperately needed to be saved. Alara did not move as the Alpha King knelt before her in the dirt. Her bare palms remained pressed flat against the pulsing golden stone, absorbing the ancient heat of the mountain that had kept her alive while the storm raged outside. She looked at him through eyes that still shimmered with the radiant light of the ley lines, seeing right through his heavy armor and into the fractured, bleeding mess of his arrogant soul. Kalen was shivering, his breath coming in shallow white plumes, his proud face marred by frostbite, and a deep agonizing desperation that she had never thought possible for a man of his stature. The sight of the absolute ruler of the Silver Peak Pack, a man who had treated her like a piece of disposable garbage just hours ago, completely broken at her feet, did not bring her a sense of petty triumph. It only brought a profound, heavy silence. The tension in the cave was thick, filled with the static charge of her waking magic and the heavy weight of his unvoiced regrets. "Why are you here, Kalen?" Alara asked, her voice dropping into a calm, resonant clarity that entirely lacked the stuttering fear of the archivist maid. She did not use his royal title. She spoke to him as an equal, her tone cutting through the quiet cave like a sharp obsidian blade. "You made your desires perfectly clear in the High Court. You told me I was nothing, that my work was a delusion, and that your warriors had no use for a girl who plays with pencils. Have you come out into the whiteout to ensure that the mountain finished the execution you started?" Kalen looked up, his icy blue eyes completely bloodshot, filled with a raw, agonizing sorrow that made his entire frame tremble. "Alara, please," he croaked, his voice cracking as he reached out a trembling, leather-gloved hand toward her, only to let it fall back into the dirt when she didn't move. "I was blind. I was an arrogant fool driven by the terror of losing my kingdom. And I committed a crime that I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for. The Iron Legion has breached the southern walls exactly as your drawings predicted. They knew our traditional defenses better than we did. My scouts are dead. My battalions are surrounded, and my people are being slaughtered in the valleys because I threw away the only truth that could have saved them. I did not come into the storm to order you back. I came to beg for your mercy." The emotional weight of his breakdown was staggering, a public confession of total failure delivered to the lowest-ranking wolf in his hierarchy. Alara looked down at the glowing golden threads beneath her fingers, feeling the mountain pulse with a sudden violent sorrow as it mirrored the suffering of the people dying in the lower passes. Her inner thoughts were a chaotic storm of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to tell him to leave, to let his proud warrior society burn to the ground under the weight of its own short-sighted arrogance. They had exiled her father, stripped her family of dignity, and forced her to live like a ghost in the dark for 10 agonizing years. Yet, as she listened to the rhythmic dying thrum of the land, she saw the faces of the innocent Omegas, the young children, and the elders who had no part in the king's pride, all of them about to be annihilated by the ruthless Iron Legion. She stood up slowly, her white cloak flowing around her like a river of moonlight as she stepped away from the golden wall. The residual elemental power rolling off her narrow shoulders was so intense that Kalen instinctively lowered his head, his alpha instincts recognizing a higher authority that had nothing to do with physical muscle. "You want my maps, Kalen?" she said, looking down at him with a gaze of solid iron. "But the map you burned was not just paper. It was my father's legacy, and it was the living spirit of this mountain. You cannot simply command the earth to save you when your swords fail. If I help you lead the survivors through the frost peaks, it will not be to save your crown or your pride. It will be to save the innocent souls you walked over on your way to that throne. Kalen pressed his forehead against the freezing stone floor of the cave, completely submitting his royal ego to her terms. Anything, Alara, he rumbled, his voice thick with unshed tears. My crown is yours. My life is yours. I will march behind you into the abyss if that is what it takes to protect our people. I swear on the blood of my ancestors that I will never silence your voice again. Ilara stared at his defeated form, the faint, shattered bond between them suddenly giving a sharp electric twitch in her chest. It wasn't the joyful warmth of a completed mating, but a dangerous, unstable spark that signaled the beginning of a long, painful transformation. She reached into her leather satchel and pulled out a fresh, unmarked piece of vellum and a single charcoal stick. The mountain is closing the lower passes, she stated coldly, turning her back on him to face the dark tunnels leading deeper into the rock. Pack your weapons, King Kalen. The war you brought to my sanctuary is about to enter the shadows, and you're going to learn exactly what it means to be guided by the invisible. The silence inside the deeper cavern was dense, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic scraping of Alara's charcoal against a flat boulder. Kalen sat on a low ledge across from her, his massive hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. The frostbite on his cheeks had begun to thaw in the warm geothermal drafts of the cave, leaving raw crimson patches. But he seemed completely oblivious to the pain. He was undergoing a profound internal collapse. You're listening to this story on the Alpha King Secrets channel. Are you enjoying today's story? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. For his entire life, he had been taught that an Alpha King was the absolute apex of existence, a solitary pillar of strength who dictated reality through commands and execution. Yet as he watched Alara's slender fingers recreate the intricate geometry of the frost peaks from memory, his entire worldview felt like a fragile shell that had been utterly shattered by his own stupidity. He looked at her small ink-stained hands and felt a wave of self-loathing so intense it made his throat tighten. He had taken those hands for granted every single day she had worked in his archives. He had passed her in the corridors without a second glance, treating her as a background fixture of his castle, rather than the brilliant living heart of his domain. The immense guilt of his actions in the High Court pressed down on his chest like a mountain of lead. He had not just rejected a tactical report, he had publicly humiliated a soul that possessed a connection to the world, so profound it made his royal lineage look entirely superficial. The faint spark of the shattered bond between them gave another painful twitch in his marrow, a constant, aching reminder of the beautiful thing he had brutally trampled out of sheer, unadulterated arrogance. Alara did not look up from her work, but she could feel the heavy current of his gaze thick with a deep, silent grief that she had never expected to feel from an alpha of his rank. Why are you staring at me like that, Kalen? She asked quietly, her voice smooth and even as she shaded a steep ridgeline on the vellum. It does not fit a king to look so defeated. Your soldiers need a commander who believes in his own steel, not an alpha who sits in the dirt watching an omega draw lines in the dark. Kalen took a ragged breath, his broad shoulders dropping as he leaned forward, completely exposing his throat in a gesture of absolute vulnerability that would have horrified his generals. I'm staring because I'm looking at a true ruler, and I'm realizing how entirely unworthy I am to even sit in your presence, he said, his deep voice carrying a raw, emotional resonance that vibrated through the quiet cave. The maps I forced my people to follow were built on pride. Alara, they were drawn by men who wanted to conquer the land, who wanted to draw lines of ownership across things they never truly understood. I looked at you and saw a servant because my mind was corrupted by the laws of my ancestors, laws that say those who cannot kill are useless to the pack. But you see the world as it actually is. You see the life in the stone. I did not just burn your map that day. I tried to burn the truth because it made my own strength look small. The honesty of his words hung in the warm air, a total surrender of his royal ego that sent a strange, confusing tremor through Alara's chest. She stopped her charcoal mid-stroke, her gaze dropping to the complex web of paths she had just rendered. For 10 years, she had lived with the absolute certainty that the alphas of the Silver Peak Pack were incapable of remorse, that they were nothing but blunt instruments of violence who would always destroy what they could not control. Hearing the king himself articulate the exact nature of his blindness was a jarring dislocation of her reality. Her inner thoughts were a tangled knot of old trauma and emerging awe. She wanted to maintain the protective wall of her cold indifference, to remind him of her father's agonizing death in the snow. But the sheer, unmasking sincerity in his icy blue eyes made it impossible to completely ignore his pain. She stood up, her fingers tracing the edge of the finished parchment before she held it out to him. "This is the path to the upper sanctuary," she said, her voice dropping into a softer but firm tone. "It is steep, and it will require your warriors to discard their heavy iron armor if they want to survive the narrow ledge paths. The mountain will not tolerate the weight of your pride, King Kalen. If you want your pack to live through the night, you must teach them to walk like ghosts, to move with the land rather than against it." Kalen reached out, his massive callous hand carefully taking the delicate vellum from her fingers as if it were made of spun glass. As their skin brushed, a sudden bright jolt of golden static flared between them, a vivid resonance of the bond that made both of them gasp. It was a terrifyingly beautiful reminder that despite the ash and the rejection, their souls were still inextricably woven into the same eternal tapestry. The glowing spark that jumped between their fingers lingered in the air like a dying star, leaving an intense, suffocating warmth in the small space between them. Alara pulled her hand back quickly, tucking her charcoal-stained fingers into the folds of her thick woolen cloak to hide the sudden violent trembling of her skin. The physical touch had cracked the icy armor she had built around her heart, forcing her to feel the massive chaotic torrent of Kalen's internal world. Through that brief connection, she had not just felt his superficial guilt, she had experienced the raw, unedited agony of his wolf, a creature that was currently weeping in the dark, desperate to touch the soul it had accidentally broken. It was a terrifying sensation that made her breath catch in her throat, a reminder that the bond they shared was a living entity that refused to die quietly. She stepped away from him, her boots clicking softly against the dry dirt floor of the cavern, trying desperately to find her emotional footing after such an intense intrusion of his spirit. She could still feel the residual golden electricity dancing across her palms, making her skin prickle with a strange ancient heat that she had spent her entire adult life trying to suppress. She turned away from him completely, her back rigid, as she stared into the deep echoing darkness of the inner cavern tunnels that wound their way toward the upper reaches of the mountain. "Do not mistake the mountain's warmth for forgiveness, King Kalen," she said, her voice carrying a sharp defensive edge that was meant to protect herself more than wound his pride. "You think that because you have confessed your arrogance in a dark cave, the slate has been wiped completely clean. But my father's bones are still out there, frozen somewhere beneath the very ice we are about to cross, because your society deemed his wisdom a form of madness. For 10 long years I had to lower my eyes and swallow my dignity every time you and your proud generals marched through the Great Hall, knowing that you considered my entire existence an administrative error. You burned my heart to keep your pride warm, and now you expect a single apology to reweave a tapestry that took 3 years of my life to create." The memories of her lonely years in the dust wrapped around her like cold chains, making her voice tremble with a mixture of old sorrow and newly discovered strength. Kalen rose from his ledge slowly, his massive frame casting a long shadowed silhouette against the glowing golden stone walls. He did not step closer to her, highly respecting the invisible barrier of her anger, but his icy blue eyes remained fixed on her profile with a look of profound, enduring patience that he had never shown to any other living creature in his entire kingdom. "I do not expect forgiveness, Alara," he murmured, his deep voice dropping into a rough emotional frequency that felt like a physical caress against her heightened senses. "Forgiveness is a luxury for those who have committed small errors. What I did in that courtroom was a betrayal of our entire pack, a betrayal of the earth that sustains us, and a brutal assault on the most beautiful soul I have ever encountered. I do not ask you to forget the 10 years of darkness I forced you to endure or the pain I caused your family. I only ask that you allow me to bear the weight of that darkness alongside you while we fight to keep our people alive." He lowered his broad shoulders, stripping away every ounce of his royal defense, leaving only the raw vulnerability of a man who knew he had broken his own world. The absolute sincerity of his words sent a strange, confusing ripple through Alara's inner defenses, disrupting the safe, predictable boundaries of her old resentment. It was becoming increasingly difficult to fight the slow, burning heat of the bond that was actively trying to heal the fracture in her chest. She looked back at him over her shoulder, her sharp hazel eyes catching the golden light of the ley lines. "If you truly mean those words, then you will prove them on the mountain," she stated coldly, her chin lifting with a new sovereign authority that made his alpha wolf incline its head in submission. "Your warriors will want to fight the storm with their shields and their roars, but you will force them to submit to my path. You will be my voice on the ice, Kalen, because they will never listen to an Omega, but they will obey their king even if it terrifies them to their core." She watched him closely, searching his features for any sign of the old arrogance, but she found only an unyielding devotion that made her own heart expand with a terrifying hope. Kalen placed his right hand flat over his heart, an ancient solemn gesture of total warrior submission that an alpha king usually only performed before the gods themselves. I am your sword and your voice, Alara, he rumbled, his jaw setting in an uncompromising line of absolute devotion. Let the High Councils scream their objections until their throats bleed. They will walk the path you draw, or they will stay behind to face the Iron Legion alone in the snows. The faint spark between them gave another distinct rhythmic throb, no longer a painful twitch of rejection, but the steady awakening heartbeat of an alliance, born from the very ashes of their mutual destruction, ready to face the lethal wilderness together. She looked at him one last time before turning back to the table, her mind resolved to the heavy task ahead. The silence of the cave deepened around them, but it was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the tense, heavy quiet of a storm waiting to break over the peaks. The heavy storm outside the granite cave seemed to recede into a distant, muffled hum as Kalen stepped closer, his massive footsteps remarkably silent on the cold stone floor. He stopped just a single foot away from Alara, respecting her personal space, but offering a proximity that allowed the raw, untamed warmth of his alpha presence to actively fight the residual chill lingering in her bones. Alara looked up slowly, her gaze locking with his icy blue eyes, which were no longer cold or distant, but filled with deep liquid gold reflections from the glowing stone formations around them. The atmosphere within the small cavern chamber grew intensely intimate, thick with the unvoiced desires of two souls that had spent long years navigating the opposite extremes of the same harsh world, now brought together by an unavoidable destiny. The quietness of the underground vault became their own private universe, a sanctuary where the rigid titles of king and servant no longer carried any weight, leaving only the raw truth of their fragile connection. Alara could feel the steady, frantic pounding of his heart, echoing through the narrow space, a sound that perfectly mirrored the turbulent shifting of her own hidden emotions. Alara took a soft, steadying breath, her hazel eyes widening slightly as Kalen reached out and gently took her small charcoal-stained hands into his massive leather-gloved ones. He did not pull her close or force any sudden movement. He simply held her hands between his large palms, his thumbs tracing the delicate lines of her knuckles, with an incredible tenderness that completely belied his immense physical power. "Close your eyes, Kalen," Alara whispered, her voice dropping into a melodic, trance-like whisper that resonated deeply within the stone walls. "If you're to be my true voice on the mountain, you must first learn to see the world that you're swearing to protect. Do not look with your physical eyes anymore. Look through the ancient blood running in your veins and the heavy weight of your boots against the bedrock." She squeezed his hands, letting her own internal barriers drop completely, allowing the raw ancestral energy of the cartographers to flow freely across the cold boundary of their skin. Kalen obeyed her command, immediately letting his heavy eyelids fall shut, as he focused entirely on the strange electric warmth flowing from her fingertips directly into his palms. For a long moment there was nothing but the heavy synchronized rhythm of their breathing in the dark, a calm baseline before the storm of ultimate revelation. Then with a sudden beautiful clarity, his consciousness was violently pulled beneath the superficial surface of reality. He did not see the blackness of his own eyelids anymore. He saw a sprawling, majestic universe of brilliant golden light. The rough granite walls of the cave disappeared entirely, replaced by massive pulsing arteries of pure liquid starlight that branched out in every single direction, weaving through the bedrock of the mountain like an immense glowing root system. He felt the slow, ancient heartbeat of the mountain core, a deep rhythmic vibration that sent a massive wave of profound awe crashing through his warrior soul, changing his perception of existence forever. The lines of energy were alive, twisting and turning with a wild, beautiful intelligence that no mortal surveyor could ever hope to capture on a flat piece of dead paper. For the very first time in his life, Kalen understood the true meaning of power. It was not the number of iron swords in his armory, or the height of his stone walls. It was this eternal living grace that sustained every single breath his people took. He saw the hidden paths Alara had mapped appearing as delicate golden threads, woven through treacherous blue-tinged glaciers and bottomless chasms that would have effortlessly swallowed his entire vanguard. He felt her mind inside this vast network, navigating the complex pathways with a brilliant, effortless mastery that made his own strategic brilliance look entirely primitive. She was the true sovereign of this realm, a quiet weaver who had been holding the fabric of their entire world together, while he and his arrogant generals played with metal toys in the mud, completely blind to the true foundations of their survival. The sheer weight of her silent sacrifice over the years pressed into his mind, filling him with a deep, shattering reverence for the woman he had discarded. A single hot tear slipped down Kalen's rugged cheek, reflecting the golden light of the ley lines, as his internal wolf bowed its head in absolute, unconditional reverence before her spirit. The immense pride that had defined his kingship for a decade withered into nothingness, replaced by a devotion so pure it terrified him to his core. "I see it, Alara," he murmured, his deep voice trembling with an emotional weight that shook his massive frame. "I see the world you protect, and I am so deeply sorry for being so blind to your light for so long. Alara opened her eyes, watching the beautiful golden reflections dance across his rugged face as their souls officially intertwined, sealing an unbreakable, slow-burning alliance that would either lead their people to absolute salvation or burn them both to beautiful ash in the deep wilderness. She felt the heavy wall around her heart fracture a little more, knowing that the king had finally surrendered his ego to the ancient truth of the stone. The return to the citadel, through the screaming white vortex of the northern passes, was a grueling test of physical endurance and raw willpower. Kalen marched slightly ahead, using his massive frame to break the absolute fury of the freezing headwind, while Alara walked directly in his shadow, her hands securely holding the freshly drawn master map beneath her heavy woolen cloak. When they finally breached the small service door and stepped back into the lower corridors of the fortress, the transition from the pristine silence of the mountain to the chaotic noise of a losing war was jarring. The air was thick with the copper scent of fresh blood, the bitter smoke of burning tapestries, and the echoing groans of hundreds of wounded warriors lined up along the stone walls. The high counselors and the remaining pack generals were gathered in the central staging area, their faces pale with terror, as the distant rhythmic thumping of the Iron Legion's battering rams vibrated violently through the floor. As Kalen and Alara stepped into the flickering torchlight of the main hall, a collective gasp rippled through the assembled crowd. High Counselor Valerius rushed forward, his expensive silk robe stained with ash, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and immediate outrage. "Your Majesty, you have returned," Valerius cried out, his voice cracking with a high-pitched panic as he pointed a trembling finger at the quiet girl standing beside the king. "But why have you brought this useless Omega back into the war room? We are surrounded on three sides. The southern gates are buckling, and we do not have time to harbor domestic servants who fled their duties in the middle of a crisis. Secure her at once and get the king his battle armor." Several heavily armed Alpha Guards stepped forward, their hand grips tightening around the shafts of their iron spears, their eyes fixed on Alara with the same casual dismissiveness that had defined her entire life in the shadows. Kellen did not wait for them to take another single step. He moved with a terrifying, blinding speed, throwing his massive arm out to shield Alara, completely blocking her from the approaching guards. "Stand down," Kalen roared, his deep alpha voice exploding through the high-vaulted chambers with such an immense, suffocating authority that the soldiers instantly froze, their weapons trembling in their hands. The sheer power of his command forced several low-ranking wolves in the room to drop to their knees out of sheer instinct. The king stepped forward, his icy blue eyes narrowing into slits of pure fire as he looked directly at the High Counselor. "You will speak her name with the utmost respect," Valerius Kalen growled, his voice dropping into a dangerous absolute calm that resonated with a lethal intent. "She is not a servant, and she is no longer an invisible outcast of this pack. She is the master cartographer of the Silver Peak, and she holds the only pathway to our survival." The entire hall fell into a dead, paralyzed silence as the king turned his back on his generals and knelt down on one knee before Alara in full view of the entire court. He reached out his hands, carefully taking the delicate charcoal-sketched map from her fingers and laying it out flat across the central tactical table, pushing aside the expensive, outdated military maps of his ancestors. From this very moment, Kalen announced, his deep voice echoing clearly into every corner of the crowded room, "You will take your orders directly from Alara. If she tells you to march, you will march. If she tells you to discard your iron armor and move like ghosts through the high ridges, you will strip your metal off without a single question. Anyone who raises their voice against her or questions her authority will be executed on the spot for treason against the crown. I have spent a decade being blind to the true magic of this mountain, but I will not allow your pride to drag this entire pack into a communal grave." Alara stepped up to the table, her small frame commanding the absolute attention of every high-ranking warlord in the room. She did not tremble. She did not hesitate. The ancestral gold of the Weaver sight flared brightly in her eyes as she pressed her fingertips onto the vellum. "The lower passes are already lost," she stated, her voice carrying a resonant, piercing clarity that silenced the distant sounds of the siege. "The Iron Legion expects us to defend the main gates until we are entirely crushed by their numbers. We are not going to fight them on their terms. We are going to abandon the lower citadel entirely and lead the survivors through the hidden geothermal passes of the Whispering Ridge. It is a narrow path, it is dangerous, and it will require absolute blind obedience, but it is the only way to save the children and the wounded." The generals stared at her intricate drawings, their eyes widening as they finally saw the secret pathways of their own home. Kalen stood by her side, his heavy hand resting securely on the pommel of his sword, his silent, unyielding presence, ensuring that the old order of the pack was officially dead and a new sovereign era had begun. The evacuation of the lower citadel was a silent, ghostly exodus that defied every single military tradition of the Silver Peak pack. Under the absolute unyielding command of King Kalen, the proud alpha warriors had been forced to strip off their heavy iron breastplates, their ornate steel gauntlets, and their massive ceremonial shields, dropping the expensive metal into great clattering heaps upon the cold stone floors of the barracks. They moved now in nothing but their thick winter furs, their breathing shallow and disciplined as they carried the wounded elders and young children up the treacherous winding staircases that led into the deepest forgotten roots of the mountain core. Alara marched at the absolute head of the massive line, her small hand holding a single flickering torch that cast long dancing shadows against the raw, unyielding granite walls that had never seen the light of day for 1,000 years. Kalen walked a step behind her, his massive bare hand holding his drawn broadsword, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the dark tunnels behind them, ensuring that the remaining high counselors did not falter or attempt to mutiny against the girl who was currently rewriting their entire destiny. The air grew progressively warmer as they descended deeper into the mountain, transitioning from the freezing drafts of the upper fortress to the thick, heavy moisture of the subterranean network. The walls began to glow with a faint natural phosphorescence, revealing the massive pulsing arteries of liquid gold that Kalen had seen in his profound vision. The warriors around them stared at the glowing stone in absolute breathless awe, finally realizing the true magnitude of the world they had spent centuries trying to conquer with simple iron tools and brute physical force. Suddenly, a deep resonant boom echoed from the upper levels of the castle, followed by a violent shudder that sent a shower of fine granite dust down upon their heads. The southern gates had officially fallen. The brutal warriors of the Iron Legion had breached the main sanctuary only to find a completely hollow shell of stone, empty rooms, and the abandoned heavy armor of an army that had chosen to disappear into the earth rather than stand and be completely annihilated. Alara stopped at a massive three-way junction, where the stone floor gave way to a series of incredibly narrow, jagged ledge paths that hung precariously over a bottomless black chasm. The cold wind from the lower ravines howled up through the cracks like a dying predator, a sound that made several seasoned generals freeze in absolute terror, their instincts screaming at them to step back from the edge. "This is the crossing of the Frost Peaks," Alara announced, her voice cutting through the rising panic with a sharp, resonant clarity that brooked no argument from the High Council. "The safe path is only wide enough for a single person to cross at a time. The stone looks solid, but it is actually a delicate shelf supported entirely by the geothermal pressure beneath us. You must place your feet exactly where I step. If you carry any hidden metal, or if you stomp your feet in panic, the structural integrity will collapse, and the mountain will drop you into the void below without hesitation." High Counselor Valerius stepped forward, his face pale with a mixture of terror and lingering resentment as he looked down into the pitch-black abyss that seemed to swallow the very light of their torches. "This is complete madness," he whispered, his voice trembling violently as he pointed a shaking finger at the narrow ledge that disappeared into the dark. "You're asking the entire leadership of this pack to risk their lives on a crumbling piece of rock based on nothing but the wild words of an outcast girl. Your Majesty, we must turn back and fight the Legion with our bare hands rather than commit suicide in the dark like trapped rats." Kalen did not speak a single word of argument. He simply stepped past the counselor, grabbed the older man by the front of his expensive silk robes, and shoved him firmly into the line directly behind Alara. "You will walk where she walks, Valerius, or I will throw you into that chasm myself right now." Kalen growled, his icy blue eyes flashing with a dangerous absolute authority that silenced any further protest from the terrified crowd. Alara turned back to the ledge, taking a long, steady breath as she let her bare feet slide out of her worn shoes to better feel the vibrations of the living rock. She stepped onto the freezing narrow rock shelf, closing her eyes for a single moment to listen to the slow, rhythmic thrumming of the ley lines running below her. The golden veins in the stone flared brightly beneath her skin, illuminating a perfectly safe, secure pathway that was entirely invisible to the naked eye of the ordinary wolves. One by one, the massive line of refugees began to follow her, their boots crunching softly against the granite as they mirrored her fluid trance-like movements. Exactly. Kalen watched over the entire crossing, his massive frame acting as a physical barrier against the howling wind, his heart pounding with a deep, overwhelming reverence for the quiet girl who was effortlessly weaving their survival out of the very shadows of the mountain. They were no longer a broken pack fleeing a catastrophic defeat. They were becoming a new kind of people, learning for the very first time to move in perfect harmony with the ancient living spirit of the land that sustained them. The heavy silence of the abyss swallowed their fears as they marched deeper into the light. The transition from the suffocating darkness of the underground network to the pristine, blinding light of the upper sanctuary was a moment of pure spiritual rebirth for the survivors of the Silver Peak Pack. As Alara stepped out of the narrow granite fissure and onto the vast snow-covered plateau of the hidden northern valley, the howling blizzard that had terrorized the lower peaks suddenly dropped into a gentle, reverent whisper. The high valley was entirely surrounded by massive, jagged walls of solid white crystal acting as a natural fortress that no ordinary army could ever hope to scale or discover from the plains below. The air here was incredibly crisp clean and completely untouched by the smoke or copper stench of the war that was currently tearing their old world to pieces. One by one, the exhausted refugees stumbled out into the pristine snow, their frozen faces turning upward to look at the warm golden sunlight that filtered peacefully through the high mountain mist, illuminating a valley of absolute peace. The sudden silence of the celestial haven was overwhelming, making many veteran warriors drop to their knees in pure disbelief. Kalen stepped out of the cave mouth last, his massive broadsword finally returning to its heavy leather scabbard as he let out a long, ragged breath of pure relief. He stood at the edge of the plateau looking down at his people who were already scattering across the valley floor, weeping tears of joy as they realized they had actually survived the impossible crossing. The high counselors who had spent the entire journey whispering mutinous thoughts in the dark were now sitting quietly in the snow, their old faces completely blank with a profound humbling awe that stripped away their remaining political pride. They had survived not because of their heavy iron shields or their long spears, but because they had submitted their lives to the invisible lines drawn by an Omega girl they had spent 10 years trying to erase from their archives. The entire social hierarchy of the pack had been utterly dismantled in the dark, leaving only a deep communal reverence for the land. They looked at her now with eyes full of a quiet, submissive wonder that no crown could ever command. Alara stood a few paces ahead of the crowd, her white cloak catching the gentle mountain breeze, her hazel eyes staring out at the vast, untouched territory of her father's dreams. The glowing golden light of the ley lines had finally receded from her skin, leaving her pale but completely composed, a sovereign figure who had successfully rewritten the destiny of an entire kingdom. Kalen walked up slowly beside her, his heavy boots making soft, rhythmic crunching sounds in the pristine snow as he stopped just a foot away from her side. He did not speak immediately, highly respecting the profound silence of her victory, but his icy blue eyes were fixed on her profile with an unyielding devotion that would never fade for the rest of his living days. The faint spark of the bond between them gave another distinct, steady throb in his chest, no longer a painful reminder of his past sins, but the beautiful awakening pulse of a completely new future. The heavy mantle of his kingship felt lighter now that it was anchored to her truth. "I told you once that your work was nothing but kitchen fairy tales," Kalen murmured, his deep voice dropping into a rough emotional frequency that carried across the quiet plateau with a striking absolute sincerity. "I told you that you were useless to this pack, because you could not swing a heavy iron sword to kill our enemies. But today you have saved every single soul that I was sworn to protect with my life. You have shown us that true strength does not live in the metal we carry or the stone walls we build, but in the quiet truth of the earth that sustains us. My crown belongs to you, Alara, and my life is forever bound to your voice. If you tell me to build a new city here in the snows, I will carry every single stone with my bare hands until my fingers bleed. I swear to you before the ancestors that your name will be written at the absolute top of our history." He lowered his head, entirely surrendering his majestic pride to her small form. Alara looked up at him, her sharp hazel eyes softening just a fraction as she saw the single hot tear that had frozen against his rugged cheek. She did not take his crown, she did not demand his submission. She simply reached out and placed her small charcoal-stained hand gently flat against the center of his heavy chest, feeling the steady, frantic pounding of his heart beneath his winter furs. "The war with the Iron Legion is not over, King Kalen," she stated, her voice dropping into a calm, resonant clarity that echoed beautifully across the pristine white valley. "They hold our old stone walls, but they can never conquer the spirit of this mountain. We will stay here in the sanctuary, we will heal our wounded, and we will learn to live like ghosts in the shadows of the frost peaks. And when the time comes for us to return to the valleys below, we will not march with heavy iron chains, we will march with the living pulse of the earth itself guiding our every step." Their eyes locked in a silent, unbreakable vow as the golden sun rose higher in the sky. The days in the hidden valley settled into a quiet, deliberate rhythm of recovery and preparation. The survivors had erected temporary shelters using woven pine branches and heavy canvas, clustered around the naturally occurring hot springs that bubbled up through the crystalline floor of the sanctuary. The warm, mineral-rich waters provided not only physical comfort against the biting high-altitude air, but also a constant supply of heat that kept the small valley fertile and green even amidst the surrounding glaciers. The fierce alpha warriors who had once spent their afternoons shouting combat challenges in the courtyard of the citadel were now seen carrying bundles of firewood, tending to the communal cooking fires and quietly listening to the instructions of the elder Omegas. The rigid, unforgiving hierarchy that had governed the Silver Peak Pack for 3 centuries had melted away in the snows, replaced by a simple shared focus on fundamental survival and collective healing. Kalen spent his mornings working alongside his men, his large hands split and calloused from hauling heavy granite blocks to fortify the narrow entrance fissure of the plateau. He had completely discarded his royal tunic, wearing only a simple leather vest that exposed his broad, scarred shoulders to the pale mountain sunlight. Yet, no matter how exhausted he was from the intense physical labor, his eyes never strayed far from the small outcropping of rock at the northern edge of the valley where Alara had established her makeshift archive. He watched her move among the children, teaching them how to recognize the different types of moss that could be used to bandage wounds, her voice carrying a soft melodic clarity that seemed to soothe the raw nerves of everyone within hearing distance. Every time she looked in his direction, the awakened bond in his chest flared with a steady, comforting heat that filled him with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged crystal peaks, casting long, violet shadows across the white landscape, Kalen walked up the steep path leading to Alara's station. He carried a small wooden bowl filled with roasted pine nuts and fresh mountain berries, a quiet offering that had become their private evening ritual. Alara was sitting on a flat stone boulder, her fingers tracing a line across a fresh map of the lower valleys that she had been developing from the structural memories of the ley lines. She looked up as he approached, her sharp hazel eyes catching the last golden rays of the twilight sun. "You look tired, Kalen," she noted softly, her tone carrying none of the old defensive coldness that had marked their interactions in the cave. "You're pushing your warriors too hard at the barricade. The mountain itself protects this entrance. You do not need to build an unyielding fortress of stone to keep the Iron Legion out." Kalen set the bowl down on the rock beside her, taking a seat on the low ledge across from her, his massive frame relaxing completely in her presence. "I'm not building it to stop the Legion, Alara," he replied, his deep voice dropping into a rough emotional frequency that reflected his inner transformation. "I'm building it to give my men something to focus their strength upon. They are warriors who have lost their home, and without a physical task their minds will turn back to the blood they spilled in the lower valleys." He looked down at her hands, which were still stained with the dark residue of her charcoal sticks. "I spoke with Counselor Valerius this afternoon. He asked me when we would begin drafting a counteroffensive to retake the main palace. He wants to march our forces back down into the lower passes before the winter snows completely block our path." Alara let out a soft, dry laugh, her fingers remaining flat against the smooth parchment. "Valerius still thinks with the mind of a dead man," she stated, her voice dropping into a resonant clarity that carried an undeniable sovereign authority. "He wants to fight an army of iron with nothing but broken pride. The Iron Legion has already consolidated their positions within our old walls. They have established supply lines and reinforced the outer gates. If we march down there now, we will be walking directly into a meat grinder designed to destroy the remnants of our line." She looked up, her gaze locking with his icy blue eyes. "We will not return until the mountain tells us it is time, Kalen. The winter will do our work for us. The heavy snows will block their supply routes, the freezing winds will crack their armor, and the lack of geothermal knowledge will turn our old castle into an absolute ice tomb for their southern soldiers." Kalen nodded slowly, his jaw setting in an uncompromising line of total agreement as he fully accepted her tactical wisdom over his own military instincts. "Then we stay here," he rumbled, his hand reaching out to touch the edge of her parchment, his fingers carefully avoiding any direct contact that might disrupt her focus. "We will stay in the shadows until you tell us the earth is ready to move. I told the High Council today that my word no longer dictates the movement of this pack. I told them that we are no longer guided by the crown, but by the invisible lines that you see in the stone." They did not argue with me, Alara. For the first time in their lives, they looked at an Omega and saw a savior rather than a servant. The quiet alliance they had forged in the dark cave was now the solid, unbreakable foundation of their entire society. A beautiful, slow-burning fire that would carry them through the deepest winter. The deep winter officially descended upon the frost peaks with a merciless, silent fury that completely transformed the world outside their high sanctuary. Massive walls of jagged blue ice hardened over the outer crevices of the mountain, sealing the hidden valley away from the rest of the continent, like a precious gemstone locked within an impenetrable vault. Inside the plateau, however, the geothermal springs continued to breathe a steady, rhythmic warmth into the air, keeping the small village of pine shelters comfortable and safe from the absolute devastation of the freezing winds. The survivors had established a sustainable routine, harvesting the thick mountain roots that grew along the heated rock fissures and preserving the dried meats they had carried from the lower storehouses. A profound sense of unity had settled over the refugees, a quiet, enduring resilience that made the grand blood-soaked history of their old military campaigns feel like a distant, insignificant memory from a lifetime they had outgrown. Kalen stood at the highest observation ledge overlooking the valley, his long winter cloak billowing out behind him as he watched the thick columns of gray smoke rise peacefully from the communal hearths below. The silver crown that had once pressed heavily against his brow was gone, replaced by a simple braided leather band, yet his presence had never felt more commanding or genuinely royal than it did in this moment of total humility. He had spent the morning working with the young Omegas, helping them construct a system of wooden aqueducts to channel the warm overflow from the springs directly into the sleeping quarters of the sick and elderly. His hands were scarred and permanently stained with the dark dust of the granite, but there was a deep, unyielding peace in his chest that he had never experienced while sitting upon the high ivory throne of his ancestors. He knew his people were finally safe, not because they were feared, but because they had learned to survive together in the dark. He turned his head slightly as he heard the soft, familiar sound of leather boots crunching against the hard-packed snow behind him. Alara walked up to the edge of the ledge, her small frame wrapped in a pristine white fur cloak that made her blend almost perfectly with the surrounding glaciers. She held a long unrolled parchment in her hands, her fingers gently tapping against the surface as she stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the vast white expanse of the lower plains below. The golden resonance of the ley lines had settled into a faint, beautiful shimmer around the edges of her hazel eyes, a permanent mark of her absolute ascension as the true spiritual guide of the pack. The bond between them gave a slow, deep throb in their marrow, a beautiful, steady heartbeat that no longer carried any traces of the old trauma or the agonizing pain of his initial rejection. It was a silent conversation that required no spoken words to confirm their mutual devotion. "The scouts returned from the lower ridges an hour ago," Alara stated quietly, her voice carrying a resonant clarity that cut through the low whistling of the mountain wind. "They report that the main palace has become an absolute graveyard for the southern soldiers. The Iron Legion did not understand the nature of the stone they tried to keep their fires burning by ripping up the ancient support beams of the lower arc. The lack of proper ventilation has filled the inner halls with toxic smoke, and the deep freeze has completely cracked their iron supply lines. They are starving Kalen, and their commanders are already beginning to abandon their posts to flee back toward the southern borders before the high passes are entirely blocked by the avalanche season. The mountain has done exactly what the ley lines predicted it would do without us firing a single arrow." Kalen turned his body fully toward her, his icy blue eyes softening with an overwhelming expression of reverence and devotion that made his broad shoulders drop in total surrender. "You saw it all before a single flake of snow even touched the ground," he murmured, his deep voice carrying a rough emotional frequency that vibrated through the quiet air between them. "You saw their defeat not through swords but through their own arrogance. If we had stayed down there and fought them with our iron shields, we would have bled ourselves dry to protect a collection of dead stone walls. Today my people are alive, healthy, and warm because I stopped listening to the High Council and started following the path that your father died trying to protect. I am ready to lead them back down whenever you give the command, Alara, but I will only move when the stone tells you it is safe." Alara looked down at the master map in her hands for a long moment, her fingers tracing the intricate golden lines that ran beneath their feet. "The winter is our shield, Kalen," she replied, her eyes reflecting the pale northern sunlight. "We do not need to rush our return or force a premature confrontation with a dying beast. We will let the deep freeze finish its work, cleansing the citadel of their intrusion while we continue to strengthen our own roots here in the sanctuary. When the first thaw begins and the ley lines open the eastern passes, we will descend not as conquerors but as the natural keepers of this mountain." Kalen reached out, his massive calloused hand hovering just an inch above hers, offering a silent vow of absolute protection that she accepted with a soft, knowing smile. They stood together at the edge of the world, watching the distant white smoke of their enemies fade into the gray winter mist, completely secure in the knowledge that their true victory was already woven into the bedrock of the peaks. The signs of the approaching spring began to manifest within the hidden valley, not through the sudden melting of the massive crystal glaciers, but through a deep, resonant vibration that echoed continuously from the subterranean geothermal veins. Alara stood within the narrow confines of her rock archive, her small fingers carefully sorting through the stacks of ancient vellum maps that her father had spent his entire life protecting from the ignorance of the High Council. The air inside the stone chamber was thick with the scent of dried pine needles and the sharp metallic tang of fresh charcoal sticks, which she had been using to map out the exact structural weaknesses of the lower citadel. For 3 months, her people had lived as ghosts in the high sanctuary, completely hidden from the eyes of the world, but they had not been idle. They had shed the heavy, arrogant traditions of their military past, transforming themselves into a highly disciplined, fluid force that moved in perfect synchronization with the hidden natural pathways of the Frost Peaks. Kalen stepped into the archive, his massive frame momentarily blocking the pale morning sunlight that filtered through the narrow entrance fissure. He carried a newly crafted short spirit shaft made from the dense, resilient wood of the mountain pine, its tip carved from the same glowing golden stone that lined the geothermal caves. He laid the weapon gently down upon the wooden table, stepping up to stand beside her, his icy blue eyes fixed on the intricate drawings of their former home. The warriors have completely finished dismantling the remaining iron armor, Ilara Kalen murmured, his deep voice dropping into a rough emotional frequency that carried a striking absolute sincerity. Every sword, every shield, and every breastplate has been melted down into simple utility tools or left behind in the deep caverns. My men are lighter now. They move through the high snowdrifts without making a single sound, and their internal wolves have learned to listen to the shifting of the wind rather than the commands of a battle horn. Alara turned her head slowly, her sharp hazel eyes catching the golden reflection of the ley lines that still flickered faintly beneath the surface of her skin. They will need that lightness for the descent, Kalen, she stated, her voice carrying a calm, resonant clarity that broke no argument from the high counselors who were currently gathering outside the entrance. The paths through the Whispering Ridge are beginning to shift as the geothermal pressure rises to meet the melting snow. If a single soldier carries the weight of the old world, the stone shelf will fracture, and the mountain will swallow them before they ever reach the valley gates. She looked out at the crowded plateau where hundreds of survivors were already packing their minimal belongings, their faces no longer pale with the terror of defeat, but glowing with a quiet, resilient strength. High Counselor Valerius walked into the chamber, his old face looking incredibly gaunt and weathered from the harsh winter, but his eyes carried a new profound humility that replaced his former political arrogance. Your Majesty, the people are fully assembled on the lower terrace, Valerius announced, his voice trembling slightly as he bowed his head deeply before both the king and the quiet Omega girl. The scouts have just returned from the southern borders with final confirmation. The remaining garrisons of the Iron Legion have completely collapsed under the weight of the winter freeze. Their supply lines are entirely destroyed, and their remaining commanders are currently trapped within the inner courtyard, frozen and starving. They are waiting for a massacre, but they do not know that we are coming from the peaks. The old man looked at Ilara, his hands shaking as he officially presented her with the ancestral compass of the pack cartographers. Kalen took the compass from the counselor's hands and placed it gently into Ilara's palm, his large callous fingers wrapping around hers with an incredible tenderness that sealed their unbreakable, slow-burning alliance. We are not marching down to commit a massacre, Valerius Kalen growled, his jaw setting in an uncompromising line of absolute devotion that echoed clearly into the outer courtyard. We are marching down to cleanse our home of the rot that brought us to the brink of total destruction. If we spill their blood out of revenge, we will simply become the same arrogant monsters that we left behind in the mud. He turned back to Ilara, his internal wolf bowing its head in absolute, unconditional reverence before her sovereign spirit. Lead us down the mountain, Master Cartographer. The Silver Peak Pack is finally ready to walk the path you draw. Because Ilara tied the master map securely to her waist, lifting her chin with a new regal authority that made every single person in the room incline their heads in silent submission. We will move at twilight, she announced, her voice dropping into a melodic trance-like frequency that resonated deeply within the granite walls. We will pass through the eastern glaciers where the Legion guards will never think to look because their heavy boots cannot cross the ice. We will take back the citadel without firing a single arrow or swinging a single iron sword. We will let the spirit of the mountain reclaim the walls, and we will establish a new sanctuary where the archives will sit at the very center of our survival. She walked out of the cave mouth first, her white cloak billowing beautifully in the crisp mountain wind, her bare feet connecting perfectly with the ancient living pulse of the earth below. Kalen followed a single step behind her, his broadsword remaining sheathed, his heart pounding with a deep, overwhelming reverence for the future they were about to build together in the Green Valleys. The descent from the high sanctuary through the eastern glaciers was a breathtaking display of perfect human coordination and absolute spiritual discipline. The massive line of refugees moved like a silent white ribbon across the pristine fields of untouched snow, their fluid movements completely synchronized with the rhythmic pulse of the mountain that Ilara could feel humming beneath her bare feet. There were no heavy iron shields to clatter against the rocks, no massive steel broadswords to weigh down the shoulders of the vanguard, and no grand military banners to catch the hostile eyes of the scouts below. The proud warriors of the Silver Peak Pack had completely transformed into a brotherhood of ghosts, their steps light and precise as they followed the intricate network of glowing ley lines that Ilara traced through the dense frozen mist. Kalen marched a single pace behind her, his massive frame acting as a physical barrier against the sudden icy gusts that swept up from the deeper ravines, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the shifting white horizon for any remaining signs of the southern invaders. The air grew progressively denser as they left the high altitudes behind, the sharp sterile cold of the upper plateau slowly giving way to the thick damp moisture of the lower river valleys. The path they traveled was treacherous, a narrow shelf of solid blue ice that clung precariously to the vertical face of the eastern ridge, hanging directly over a bottomless chasm that had swallowed entire armies in centuries past. The southern commanders of the Iron Legion had completely ignored this route during their initial invasion, deeming it an absolutely impossible passage for any large body of soldiers, completely blind to the geothermal veins that warmed the core of the rock from within. Alara stopped at the edge of a massive frozen waterfall, her hazel eyes catching the faint golden glow of the ancient energy lines that branched out like delicate spiderwebs beneath the solid sheet of ice. She turned her head slightly to look back at the long line of elders and children, her voice dropping into a calm, resonant clarity that cut through the low whistling of the valley wind. The ice ahead looks solid, but it is actually a hollow shell created by the warm air rising from the lower fissures, Ilara announced, her small hand reaching out to touch the frozen surface, her fingers leaving a soft, glowing trace of golden heat against the blue glaze. If you step with too much force or if your mind is filled with panic, your weight will shatter the crust and the mountain will drop you into the thermal vents below. You must let your internal wolves guide your balance, matching your breath to the slow vibration of the stone. Kalen stepped forward immediately, his large calloused hand wrapping securely around the shaft of his pine spear as he placed his foot exactly where her bare print had left a mark in the frost. He turned back to face his remaining generals, his icy blue eyes narrowing into a dangerous, uncompromising line of total authority. "You heard the master cartographer," Kalen growled, his deep voice carrying a rough emotional frequency that resonated with an absolute sovereign command. "Forget your old training and trust the earth beneath you." One by one, the silent column of refugees began to cross the fragile ice shelf, their movements fluid and trance-like as they mirrored Alara's precise steps with an incredible, unyielding devotion. High Counselor Valerius moved near the center of the line, his old body trembling slightly from the sheer physical exertion, but his face carried a profound serene humility that completely replaced the desperate political arrogance of his past life in the court. He looked at the quiet Omega girl, who was effortlessly leading them through the jaws of death, and for the first time in his entire existence, he understood that true power did not live in the high stone walls of a fortress, but in the deep ancient wisdom of the land. The heavy silence of the glacier swallowed their fears, transforming their retreat into a majestic pilgrimage of rebirth as they descended closer to the outer defenses of their captured home. As the twilight hours began to bleed into a deep indigo night, the massive stone silhouette of the lower citadel finally appeared through the thick mountain mist, its grand ivory towers looking dark, silent, and completely broken under the heavy weight of the winter freeze. The proud iron gates that had once stood as an impenetrable barrier against the world were now sagging on their frozen hinges, completely choked with massive snowdrifts that the southern soldiers had been too weak to clear away. There were no watchfires burning along the outer parapets, no sounds of drunken celebration echoing from the great halls, and no disciplined patrols moving along the walls. The Iron Legion had been completely conquered by the very environment they had tried to chain, their grand military machine rendered utterly useless by the silent, merciless fury of the frost peaks. Alara stopped at the final ridge overlooking the northern courtyard, her heart pounding with a mixture of old sorrow and newly discovered strength as she looked down at the home she had been forced to flee. Kalen stepped up beside her, his massive shoulders squaring as he looked down at the hollow shell of his former kingdom, his hand resting gently flat against the center of his chest where the awakened bond gave a distinct rhythmic throb of absolute readiness. "They are already defeated, Alara," he murmured, his deep voice dropping into a rough frequency of total submission to her guidance. "Their spirits are broken, and their bodies are frozen within our walls. We do not need to shed a single drop of blood to reclaim this sanctuary. We only need to show them the way out of our mountain." Alara looked up at him, her sharp hazel eyes softening just a fraction as she felt the beautiful slow-burning heat of his devotion radiating across the small space between them. "The time of iron is officially over, King Kalen," she stated calmly, her voice carrying a resonant, piercing clarity that sealed the final phase of their journey. "Let us go down and show them how to live in harmony with the stone." The reclamation of the citadel was not a bloody siege of iron and fire, but a quiet, majestic reclamation by the mountain itself. As Alara and Kalen stepped through the shattered northern gates at the head of the silent column, the few surviving guards of the Iron Legion dropped their rusted weapons into the snow, their hollow, frostbitten faces looking up in absolute terrified awe. They did not see an invading army. They saw a unified people moving like spirits through the freezing mist, guided by an Omega girl whose very presence seemed to command the latent warmth of the earth. The southern invaders, broken by 3 months of starvation and the relentless, unforgiving frost, were gently but firmly herded toward the southern passes, allowed to flee back to their warm homelands with their lives, carrying with them the terrifying legend of the living mountain that could not be conquered by mortal metal. By the time the golden sun of early spring finally breached the highest crystal peaks, the central courtyard of the citadel was completely cleared of the enemy's defilement. The heavy iron banners of the legion were pulled down from the parapets, cast into the central courtyard, and replaced not with the royal standards of the past, but with long woven tapestries of green moss and white pine that symbolized their new eternal alliance with the land. The hundreds of refugees gathered in a massive silent circle around the ancient stone dais, where Kaelin had once stood as a distant, unyielding tyrant. The high counselors, the weathered pack generals, and the lowest-ranking servants stood side by side, the old social boundaries completely erased by the shared sacrifice of their winter exile, their faces glowing with a profound, communal reverence that transformed the cold fortress into a true sanctuary. Kaelin stepped onto the center of the stone platform, his massive frame illuminated by the brilliant, untamed light of the morning sun. He held his royal silver crown in his large calloused hands, his icy blue eyes sweeping across the vast crowd of his people with a deep, humbling sincerity that made his broad shoulders drop in total surrender to the new order. "My people," Kaelin announced, his deep alpha voice exploding through the high vaulted arches with a striking absolute authority that no longer required the threat of a sword to command obedience. "For 3 centuries, we believed that our strength lived in the weight of the iron we carried and the height of the stone walls we built to isolate ourselves from the world. We played with metal toys in the mud, completely blind to the ancient living spirit that sustains every single breath we take. That ignorance brought us to the very brink of total annihilation." He turned his body fully toward Alara, who stood at the base of the steps, her small frame wrapped in her white fur cloak, her hazel eyes reflecting the brilliant golden lines of energy that were now pulsing peacefully beneath the stone floor of the courtyard. Kaelin knelt down on one knee before her in full view of the entire assembled court, dropping his head in absolute, unconditional reverence as he extended his hands to offer her the crown. "This crown does not belong to a warrior who ruled through fear," Kaelin murmured, his deep voice trembling with a rough, emotional frequency that resonated into the deepest corners of the crowded square. "It belongs to the voice that guided us through the jaws of death when we were entirely blind. From this day forward, the Silver Peak Pack will no longer be governed by the laws of iron or the pride of alphas. We will be guided by the master cartographer, and our strength will only be used to protect the sacred balance of the stone." A collective, breathless murmur of absolute agreement rippled through the massive crowd as High Counselor Valerius stepped forward, his old face wet with tears of pure relief as he dropped to his knees beside the king, followed instantly by every single general, warrior, and elder in the courtyard. They did not bow out of fear or forced submission. They bowed out of a deep, shattering reverence for the quiet girl who had rewritten their destiny in the dark. Alara looked at the thousands of souls looking up at her, feeling the heavy defensive wall around her heart fracture and dissolve, completely replaced by a beautiful, slow-burning warmth that was perfectly mirrored by the steady, frantic pounding of Kaelin's heart through the awakened bond in their marrow. She did not take the silver crown. Instead, she reached out her small charcoal-stained hands and gently closed his fingers over the metal, lifting him back up to stand as her equal. "We will not wear crowns of silver or iron anymore," King Kaelin, Alara stated, her voice dropping into a calm, resonant clarity that carried a piercing sovereign authority across the silent valley. "We will rebuild this palace together, not as masters who conquer the mountain, but as the humble caretakers of its ancient secrets. The great archives will sit at the very center of our lives, and the pathways we walk will always be the ones drawn by the living pulse of the earth." She stepped to the edge of the dais, placing her bare foot flat against the central granite stone. As her skin touched the bedrock, a massive, beautiful wave of pure liquid gold starlight flared brightly from her position, rushing through the entire courtyard and weaving through the foundations of the citadel, officially sealing an unbreakable, eternal era of peace that would sing through the frost peaks for 1,000 generations. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction, created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.